Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome. I am excited today to be talking about Sunshine Week and investigative reporting with a little dose of public record. So in the studio, we have Maddie O'Neill, an ace freelance reporter for various news outlets, and Jeremy Cox, a reporter for the Bay Journal. Welcome, Maddie and Jeremy, to the program.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah, good to be here.
Yeah, no, it's terrific to have you guys because you've worked in this area for a long time, seen a lot of stuff going on. And I wanted to ask each of you sort of what your one of your favorite investigations or what you've been working on in the past year that you kind of want to talk about so we can really get into what is involved in investigative reporting and what happens. Jeremy, you want to jump in first?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give all the credit to my colleagues because MDDC recognized our work this past year for revealing the extent of coal ash toxic sites around the mid-Atlantic. So coal ash, these are sites where the remnants from power plants, this toxic ash, it has been dumped over many decades, and in many cases, right near our waterways, because the power plants are often sited next to water. You need water for some place to dump to get your water and to dump effluent. So these sites now, obviously, being near water is attractive for developers, and neighborhoods have grown up around them. And these sites can, given their age, they don't often comply with modern landfill requirements, and so they can leach these chemicals into the groundwater around. So arsenic, mercury, lead, all these bad things getting into the waterways. And so my colleagues, Tim Wheeler and Whitney Pipkin, so Tim's in Maryland and Whitney, she's since moved on to the great freelancer in the sky, but no, she's alive. But yeah, she's moved on to another entity. But they worked on obtaining information about where these sites are. And so we were able to publish one of the first region-wide maps of where these sites are located so that communities could be connected with these, find out where these dangers lurk in their midst.
Yeah. Well, and I do think that's such a regionally important, and it's a little different because when you get into the local news world, which MDDC represents a lot of local news organizations, you're really talking about a concrete geographic district. And so the Bay Journal kind of reaching beyond and doing that regional piece, lots of different threads that you're trying to pull. So can't wait to hear a little bit more about how that all comes together. But Maddie, what's your investigatory piece that you're most interested in?
So the one that I am really wanted to highlight today was the story that I wrote for the Baltimore Banner about a police chief in Cumberland, Maryland, out in Western Maryland, who 10 years ago was investigated for and admitted to exchanging what he described as filthy messages with a 17-year-old girl who he had met at an outreach event for police in the community to meet each other. The story took me over a year to report from when I got the initial tip to when I was actually able to publish, and a huge part of that was the county, Allegheny County, putting me through a 10-month records request fight to get what was very obviously a public record under Maryland's public records laws. I knew that, but the county was firm in refusing to give me the record, and so it took 10 months, but I finally won and was able to do the story that I knew had been there the whole time.
And
The
that
chief
was a wild story. I mean, but we'll get into it.
wild story. and it took so long to report even though I think this is something that people don't always know about investigative journalism, like, you know something, but you can't report on it until you prove it. And so you can have a copy of a record and still have to go through an extensive process to make sure that that record is verifiable and that it's true. And so that's what really took me a really long time was just getting a hold of the public records here. And the county, repeatedly tried to deny me the records for a variety of reasons. And we took it all the way to the Maryland Public Information Act Compliance Board. I'm 3 for 3 in terms of winning public
Woohoo!
requests with the compliance board. So hopefully I can keep that going this year with more records requests.
Absolutely. So, well, let's talk about sort of what goes into an investigatory piece because, like you saw the pieces of the puzzle with the Cumberland sheriff, but you have to prove it. And I'm sure, Jeremy, with the coal ash issue, you're seeing all these pieces, and but what goes into kind of getting it from hunch to reported piece? Anyone want to jump in?
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sure. Um, Obviously, you know, journalists get the news from one of two ways. It is handed to you from above, so authorities having a press conference, sending out a press release, or some event happens in the wild that you rush out to cover. The other category is, I think, a little bit more appropriate for this conversation, which is, journalists create the news. That doesn't mean we make it up. It means that we follow our journalistic senses. And okay, there's this trend I'm hearing about in the community, or I'm hearing some, rumors or scuttlebutt about, let's say, a sheriff's behavior somewhere. And okay, that's where public records can often come in and seal the deal for you, right? Um, you may not be able to talk to people, may not be willing to talk to you on the record about uh, what's going on. In this case, in the coal ash case, the EPA is, and federal agencies in general, are increasingly tight-lipped about
Hmm.
anything. You know, you'll ask for an interview, and 9 times out of 10, you'll just get a written statement back from the press office. And this is Democratic and Republican administrations. In the case of this story, we were only granted an interview with EPA on the condition that we not name this official.
Interesting. Well, and I
Mm,
wanted to ask, I've been seeing more and more like the push to the public information officer. Like you
mhm.
can't talk to anyone who's like directly related to the topic at hand. It is all going through kind of like the PR office. Are you
Yeah.
seeing that? And what does that mean for investigative work?
Oh, you'll you'll love my anecdote. So this past weekend, I went down to, it's called Fisherman Island. It's at the tip of the Delmarva Peninsula. So if you've ever taken the Chesapeake Bay Bridge tunnel there across the mouth of the Chesapeake, there's that first little bridge you go to heading south that goes onto a little landmass, and then you hit the bridge proper. Well, that little landmass is actually a national wildlife refuge,
Hmm,
and you can't just get out of your car and walk around. It's actually illegal to do that. But they offer tours through the Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages the land that, during the non nesting season, anyway, for the birds out there. So cool. Travel story. We do travel stories. What can you learn? Basic story about what can you experience? Why is it run this way? I don't want to call it a puff piece, but here we are.
that's
And
not like hard hitting gotcha
yeah,
journalism, though.
no.
Like,
And so, I mean, I don't blame this person, but I reached out to the, like any member of the public would, hey, interested in RSVPing for this tour. And by the way, I'm a reporter. So just in case there's, you know, any extra hoops I have to jump through, knowing I probably would be the case. And sure enough, the next second email I got after that was from the region press office. What questions are you going to plan to ask, and what's the story about, and how, can we see it before it's published, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I had to kind of be like, look, I'm happy to share some quotes with you or whatever, but I don't know what all my questions are gonna be till I'm out there. I haven't experienced it yet. And eventually we got to a place of agreement, but I'm like, if I'm having to do this for a soft focused travel piece, I can only imagine what people are having to do when there's actual controversy involved.
Yeah, so Maddie, you are 3 for 3 at the Public Information Act Compliance Board, super exciting. And I feel like that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of some of the challenges that you face in getting public records. So tell us a little. You can vent to us. Tell us your traumas.
Wow, that's quite an offer. I don't know that we really can go that deep into it for a full vent sesh here, but no, I mean to what Jeremy was just describing, that's like it's a growing problem with government agencies and officials where they will agree to a background briefing, but you can't name the person who is giving you the information. These are people who are paid with taxpayer dollars. It's really like it's getting out of hand, and it's incumbent on us as journalists to push back on it. I think that I've run into this at courthouses where, I'm there requesting a public record. Any member of the public can walk into a courthouse and request this record. But when they realize that you're a journalist, they say, oh, there's an extra form you have to fill out, or I have to get permission from my boss.
Oh,
No, you
interesting.
don't. That's simply not true. And that's just not how it works. I am as a representative of the public. I'm here to help the public understand what's going on in public documents. And so the additional barriers that get thrown up to stop journalists from accessing very basic public information are a real threat to our profession and our ability to do our jobs. And the Cumberland story is a good example of that. I got a tip. I received a fragment of a public record, but I knew that I needed to confirm that this record was real. And so I requested it. And it was very clear under Maryland law. Maryland actually has a fairly progressive law in terms of our ability to access police discipline
Mhm.
records as of fairly recently. So it was very clear under Maryland law that I had the right to access this record. And the county came back with a series of explanations for why they were not going to give me the record that, once we took it all the way to the compliance board, it became clear that those were lies. They were lying to prevent me from accessing what was clearly a public record that gave insight into how the chief police officer in a small town in Western Maryland had been disciplined for having inappropriate conversations with a teenage girl. It really raises questions about uh, the counties. In Pennsylvania, where I first started reporting, you could ask for sanctions when people lied or prevaricated to prevent you from getting public records.
Mm.
I would love to see something like that in Maryland. Maryland's public records laws simply do not have the teeth or the accountability mechanisms that we need to hold people accountable when they lie to us in order to prevent us from getting public records, which is what happened in this case. And fortunately, I was able to win that by taking it to the compliance board, which saw through their lies. But not everyone has the time or the resources to do that. And so it's really important, and I think incumbent upon us as journalists to push back in an organized way and advocate for more public access and greater, stronger public records laws, because things are not good as they stand now. There's
Well,
my
and there's 2 things I wanna draw out of that. We've got, the as you said, Maddie, the journalists are just a stand-in for the public. There is under Maryland law, DC law, Delaware law, there is no special right of journalists to access public records. So, really, as an individual, you could walk up and ask for anything. Now, journalists are professional users of those public records laws, and so you kinda know, like, what to ask for and how to ask for it. And we've been doing the Press Association, of course, has a robust lobbying effort on behalf of our members, and we deal a lot in transparency issues and access issues. And it is very, very hard to write any type of sort of consequences into public records law or any type of really accountability. So there aren't even with the expanded powers of Maryland's Public Information Act Compliance Board to compel, records release, um, they're still, like, very, um modulated responses
Mm.
because you then are in the courts. And we only got those changes to the Public Information Act Compliance Board maybe like 2 or 3 years ago that they could say, "No,
Mhm.
you must release."
Yeah.
It used to be it was just an opinion. It's just our opinion that you should give those records, and the circumstances that we're in now, like, people just don't litigate because the news cycle is also so fast in many respects that you have to move on to something else. It has to be a passion if you really want a record. And it feels sometimes like custodians take advantage of that. Like, oh, if we just delay. And I don't know if you all have seen an increase in the amount of time that it takes. I mean, I hate to say it, Maddie, I don't think your 10-month sojourn, it's not nothing, but it certainly is not like I've heard 3, 4 years. What's the longest time that you all have had to wait for public records? Do you recall? I feel like
I'm sure
Brian
I have
Steers has
some that are
this,
still
like,
pending
epic.
out there.
I waited, it was about 2 years
Mm.
for, a report, from the federal government about a drone crash, uh, into the marshes of Dorchester County here on the Eastern Shore,
Hmm,
um, to the point that when I came in the mail, I'm like, "What is this?" Forgot about that, and that's actually not atypical.
mhm. So how do you get around, I mean, 'cause, you're not gonna just say, "Oh, well, we'll let that, the filthy messages fall by the wayside or the coal ash, plants, we just won't worry about that." How do you, in an investigation, kind of what other avenues do you have to get the information you're looking for? Or is it always public records and only public records?
It's not always and only public records, but I will say I have a special fondness for public records as a courts reporter because the courts are one of the places where records are made public, usually as a matter of course. And so there's less fighting that you have to do. Not
Mhm,
always. And sometimes the courts will go out of their way to make things difficult for you. And if you do not have access to legal resources, you might just be out of luck. And so that's a problem. But no, it's not just public records. I just personally love public records
you're
because
so
they're right,
definitive too.
they're in black and white. You can,
Yeah,
it's right there in front of you. But of course there are, other ways to access the information and working your sources and just honestly just going to meetings sometimes in my Cumberland story, none of the members of city council were getting back to me. I just went to the city council meeting. I drove a couple hours out to Western Maryland, sat through a boring city council meeting, which, reporters do from time to time, and then just approached the mayor at the end of the meeting. And that's how I got his response and learned that he knew about the investigation into the messages that the chief had sent. Um, so, there's plenty of avenues. And I think one thing that I learned while I was reporting on the Cumberland story was that um, you catch more flies with honey, and when you are approaching a subject to ask difficult questions, um, you know, it can be more fruitful to just adopt a friendly tone than to be hard hitting. And I think as investigative reporters, sometimes it can be tempting to just be hard hitting and go at them with the questions. And, in this case, I found that I actually learned a lot more by just being friendly, and they obviously didn't like what I had to say, but I ended up getting a statement from the ex chief. He resigned while I was investigating,
mm,
and it confirmed my reporting, and so I was able to glean a lot more information that way than if I had just kind of gone at them in the way that I think investigative reporters sometimes love to do. But I had an editor who said maybe cool off the tone of these questions and you will glean more. And he was absolutely right. So that was
mhm.
something that I really learned on this investigation.
I love that, and I think, sometimes, like, when you think about just the level of frustration, people aren't getting back to you, or they're obfuscating, or in this case, outright lying to keep you from those records. Like, it's a lot of pent-up emotion
Oh, yeah.
that you're carrying with you as you're, like, ruminating on that drive to Cumberland to be like, "I'm gonna get him." But that subject is just like, "I'm just walking out of this meeting. Who are you, like, coming
Yeah.
at me on this?" So
Let's. That's a
It makes
fascinating
sense.
window that Maddie has there because, personal relationships are kind of the antithesis to public record, right? I mean, our romantic liaisons are kind of the opposite of that. And so it's interesting that, it was that you had this window in it through this, administrative process. But there can be records that can also serve. So, for example, if a source is going through a divorce at the time, there can be discovery through that, or a bankruptcy proceeding at
I
the
love
federal
bankruptcy.
level. What's that?
I love bankruptcy records.
Yes,
And
great
actually,
detail.
there is a bill that will seal divorce proceedings. We spoke out against it, but that's grinding through the legislature right now. So get
Hmm.
it while before October 1. Um,
Yep.
find your divorce proceedings because they are likely to be sealed. And we'll come back to like the issue around privacy and records. But Jeremy, complete your thought.
Oh yeah.
I don't have a filter and I couldn't wait. I'm sorry.
No, we environmental reporters usually are just asking for like spill records and yeah, and enforcement records from environmental regulators. So it's nice to be able to uh, remember my days as more of a general assignment reporter. But no, to your question about the what sort of tools are available beyond public records, I learned and I try to practice the fact that public records are only the starting point. They're not the end of the journey; they're the start of the journey. So you got to fill in the human dimension. What do these numbers mean? What's the context? The people behind them, who created them, or that the numbers describe, going out and getting their stories. Because otherwise, all you have is a black and white document and some numbers, perhaps. And
Hmm.
so they are public records are an avenue for storytelling, but they're not storytelling in and of themselves.
Hmm. So really just creating that full picture and finding like the people who were impacted. And I was curious, Maddie had said she was able to, for this story, drive out to Cumberland and all the people that she wanted were basically in the city council meeting.
Yeah.
But you deal with a lot of different levels. So you have the local, the state, the federal level, and they all kind of come together in
Hmm.
environmental reporting. And so I don't think that there are any, like meetings of all those people. How do you chase them down if
Yeah.
you're not like stalking behind houses, of course, but like how do you do it?
It happens sometimes. So, like last week, I went over to DC to cover the public meeting that DC Water was holding about the Potomac Interceptor sewage spill. Normally, I would certainly take up their opportunity to watch it online, but I knew I wanted to be able to talk to the humans who were in the audience, and that a lot of them would be there for that. So that's often the case. But on the environmental beat, you're absolutely right. So you have to look. There's going to be state level meetings. For example, MDE is required to uh, host meetings about many of its different regulatory changes, or if just one person from the public challenges a permit uh, for a certain kind of permit, for example, concentrated animal feeding operation, CAFO,
Mhm,
you're required to have a meeting. And we cover the Chesapeake Bay cleanup, and there's a whole government, infrastructure that seeks to, you know, partner up the various levels of government that you talked about, and so they have meetings. But yeah, the meetings are also like public records. Like I understand if you're on deadline and that's what you got to do, then write about that meeting. But the goal is always write about the issue, write about the impact. Don't write about the meeting.
mhm. Uh, if more people followed that, I feel like, municipal level reporting would be a lot more interesting. Nobody wants the game play by
Yeah.
play on a meeting.
Yeah.
And there's always interesting stories that come out of that.
Well,
So, in your investigations, how do you keep it all organized? I mean, like, I'm just thinking of like this long tail of, oh my gosh, sometimes you're waiting nearly a year, sometimes over a year. There's lots of records. Um, and I've seen reporters' desks when we were more paper based and they were all just piled high. How do you keep it from getting so overwhelming that you just can't do the work?
That's a great question, Rebecca, and I
Because
will
I wanna
be
know.
no, I will be so honest and say I don't think I have a great system. I usually I open a Google Doc for all of my notes on a given story, and that's where everything goes. And then I make sure that I read through that entire Google Doc before I write my story because you always forget a little detail or there's a little something, a weird little, anecdote that someone told you that suddenly makes more sense when you've reached the end of your reporting. So is that a good system that other people should follow? Probably not. It is my system. And in the case of the Cumberland police story, because it took so long, I was switching email addresses. Like I changed jobs twice during the
Oh, wow.
investigation. So I had to be a little bit more organized on that one. And I also, which I shouldn't have let this happen, but I had to rely on the clerks, the public records clerks to help me get some like, can you send me my own request back? At one point I had to ask,
Oh,
which is
wow.
terrible. I should not have done that, but I unexpectedly lost access to some of my emails.
Mm,
So, sometimes it happens, and that's a time when it is good to be in the good graces of the clerks who are doing the sort of administrative work.
Mm.
Um, to do the public records requests. And obviously you should not rely on that, but it is sometimes that's the way it goes. So that's my system, but I'm sorry that's a pretty bad answer.
No, and it's fascinating to get the window into the world. Jeremy, are you, or do you have some sort of flashy system we should know about?
oh, yeah. No, I've graduated from the days of yellow legal pads, and
Mm,
wherever I
okay.
have space on that piece of paper, to the Google Drive, file, and same thing, but I just wanted to add one I do all of that. I would just add one detail, which is, um, make a note of when you called or emailed somebody the first time. So, I'll say LM left message, Rebecca Snyder, March 6th, 2:07 to the minute, I'll put. And then I know, a week later, because I work for a monthly, I'll look back and be like, "Ooh, I still don't have any notes below that section. That means she hasn't gotten back to me. So, damn it, Rebecca, I'm gonna elevate this to a phone call now or
Oh, yeah,
whatever."
chase me down for sure.
Yeah,
That's a
that
great
would
note,
never
Jeremy.
by the way, happen with you. And more
That's very common.
complicated when you have a lot of different you know, irons in the fire, a lot of different requests out. You may want to start like an Excel file,
Mhm,
and have for each column, what is the entity? When did you submit it? What did you ask for? When is the expected date that it should be, by regulation, 30 days in some states, 15 for others.
mhm.
Um, and I'm sure you could do this, set little alarms or reminders for yourself.
Do that.
So yeah, the more organized I'm glad you brought it up. The more organized you are, the more future you will thank you.
Yes, I feel like we're all working towards
Yeah.
making future us grateful for past us. Um, but so now, and I know the Cumberland situation was pretty cut and dried. Like you had one specific thing you were trying to get out, but like when you have an inkling, but you're not quite sure where the story's going, like what you're going to find in an investigation, maybe it's a little bit wide ranging. How do you kind of approach riding all the ponies at the same time? Because, um, like it just do you kinda, like, run one lead to the ground and then be like, "Okay, well, it wasn't this area over here." And I'm thinking kind of like in the environmental world, there could be so many causes for, the end result. Like, how do you approach, like, just when you're in the beginning stages of investigation, which direction you guys wanna go? Because I think, Maddie, didn't you do something with prisons last year too? Or am I misremembering?
I think I did not, but, I wrote about bail reform last year,
Oh, yeah.
which maybe was it, but,
Mhm.
yeah, no, I'm sorry to keep referring back to this, but to give the Cumberland police example, I got this tip and I didn't know where the public record lived, and so I had to
Yes.
send a lot of different public records requests all over the place and get a lot of "We don't know what you're talking about" responses. which is not ideal, but sometimes that's all you can do. And so I guess in that case, it was just a divide and conquer. Start with anywhere it could be. There it could be the county, the city, it could be the state police, it could all these different entities.
Right.
And so it was just a divide and conquer until I found the right spot, and it ended up being in not where it should have been, essentially. So, like, the
How so?
Cumberland Police Department had destroyed its records of this investigation because of an expungement situation that, it's very detailed to get into
No.
with Maryland's public records laws, but a different law enforcement agency had kept its records, and so I was able to get them that way,
Wow.
which was honestly pure luck that that expungement process that happened in Cumberland hadn't reached or hadn't gotten to that other agency. I actually heard that the chief who was the subject of my investigation reached out to that law enforcement agency 2 days before I filed my public records request and asked for the whole record to be expunged. So it was very lucky. The timing worked out very
Yeah.
well. Because he was going around trying to destroy any records that still existed of this investigation, and I just happened to, I guess, beat him to this one, and they said no to the expungement. But yeah, no, it's really just a grind. It's a divide and conquer and keep going until you find it kind of situation. In
Well,
my
and expungement and Jeremy, I wanna hear your thoughts on this
Mhm.
as well, but I also wanna go back to expungement because that has been an ongoing issue probably for the last, 8 to 10 years. It's been a big deal, and I personally believe so much in second chances and the fact that news media reports on you
Yeah.
know, a a very small segment of the population, but it's really like, there's material things that are being lost that are in the public interest when you expunge at such a high level, and so I wanna hear a little bit more about some of the challenges that you faced with expungement. But before we do that, Jeremy, how do you, like, run all your leads to ground?
Yeah, certainly. It's almost like the scientific method, right? You start off with a hypothesis, and then, okay, let me test that hypothesis against the data and the anecdotes and the quotes that I get and all that. And, just like a scientist, you have to be open to sometimes you're not going to confirm the original hypothesis, and you have to, follow the evidence where it takes you. Um, so, a case where uh I think in this uh it'll be interesting to continue to follow this sewage spill case. If you're not familiar with it, I don't know where you've been, but yeah, 300 million gallons of sewage pouring into the Potomac River.
Huge.
And, obviously a very salient example of infrastructure gone wrong. But I don't know that people realize just how often this occurs. I think we've had, you know, several at least incidents involving some kind of contaminant uh, since this occurred on January 19th, just here in Maryland. And so I
Mhm,
did a story, it was a year or two ago now, looking at what these are known as sewage overflow events that are, and they're required by law to be reported to the Maryland Department of the Environment.
mhm.
And getting these reports, and I chose, these don't make news generally because it's a dog bites man situation. But I was like, let's just pick a kind of just a typical rain event, where we got 3 inches or something in 24 hours. Not really anything that caught people's eye at the time, but just goes to show it doesn't take a lot. And I came back with an overload of records. We looked at, Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. And so that was an interesting exercise because everyone's got their own different rules about how to
Sure.
report and, when and how often. And, it showed that, yeah, kind of in this case, it was what I expected in a lot of ways. Like, yep, there were certainly a lot of places, but they weren't, maybe the big ones you would expect, the ones that make the news, like the Back River plant
Mhm.
necessarily in Baltimore, or the Blue Plains, the largest wastewater treatment plant in the region, and there in DC. It was these little guys in communities of just a few hundred people or a few thousand. So when you really, chase it down and when you get the whole tranche of records in front of you, like that, when you do, like Maddie said, open yourself up to be surprised, then I think that's when the interesting stories come out.
The process of continuous revelation right there.
Hmm.
Now, I I'm wondering, what would you like the public to know about investigative reporting that you think either they misunderstand or they don't quite get, or just something that's on your heart that you want, you know, people to know? 'Cause
Hmm.
I'm not sure there's been so many studies recently about, you know, fewer journalists in the US, and I think Maryland itself has less than 1,000 journalists across the entire state. So not everybody has the glory of knowing a journalist up close and personal. And so I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the work and how it like why you do it and how you do it. So is there anything you want to say to members of the public or things you wish they would know?
Hmm. I think there is an impression by people who, like you said, have not had the opportunity to speak with a journalist or, learn a little bit about what the job is like, understandably. I think there's a perception that we just publish things without confirming their accuracy, or that we publish things without thinking about the consequences of what that will be. And I would love to emphasize that not only do we work really, really hard to get to the truth of the matter and figure out what actually happened, but we also think really, really hard about what the consequences of publishing things will be. At least, I mean, I do, and I think the reporters that I work with do. And so I think sometimes people will just think like, "Oh, why did you do this story?" Um, and I just would like people to know that a lot of thought and sometimes anxiety and sometimes stress goes into thinking about, should we publish this? What is the most responsible way to publish this? What is a way to publish this that doesn't harm people?
Mhm,
That's something that I am constantly trying to think about. You know, I I know that we don't follow the same code as doctors, but I generally try to do no harm with my reporting. And,
mhm,
that means thinking beyond the usual, just like the day-to-day reporting that we do, and thinking about, how will publishing this person's name affect their life? And
mhm.
especially with things being the way they are on the internet, how will publishing
Yeah.
this person's name affect their life possibly forever? And so I try to be really thoughtful about that, and I think that sometimes I see in the comments of stories people suggesting that, that was not considered, and I promise you it was.
Many late
Yeah.
nights, many yeah, long and hard. Jeremy,
Yeah,
what do you wish
sleepless
people
nights.
knew? Yeah.
So yes to all that. Um, so I am an adjunct here at Salisbury University, and I teach an intro to mass communications class, which basically a media literacy class. And I
Mhm,
think the statement I make on the first day and, hammer home as often as I can is, I want you to think about your media diet the same way as you might your actual like food diet.
mhm,
If all you're consuming is junk food, and fats and, tra- high processed foods, the equivalent of that in the media sphere, then you're going to get sick. You're not going to live as long as you could. I mean, that's maybe a bit dramatic, but um, you're doing that to yourself if you approach your media consumption in a laissez-faire kind of way. Like, I'm going to let the algorithm, here
mhm,
on TikTok or X or whatever the next thing that the 24-hour cable channel decides I, you know, need to consume next. If I sit there and let others dictate what my diet should be. And so my message to them, to the students and to your audience is to be intentional about that diet, to take control of it yourself, the same way you do when you decide, what you're going to have for dinner, right?
mhm.
You wouldn't, I hope, just say, I'm just going to pizza all the time. Sometimes, yeah, not necessarily you gotta eat your vegetables all the time, but if you're not getting that part, having a diverse diet, different viewpoints of, you know, hearing from different voices and maybe different subjects, then I don't think you can be a very good participant in this experiment we call democracy.
Mhm. So being just aware of what's going on and interested in your community, it sounds pretty important
Hmm.
to you.
Yeah.
All right, I want to get back to expungement because I feel like the Swiss cheese that case search and whatnot has become like. What is that? How does that affect your reporting, especially in investigative work?
I have a lot of thoughts on expungement. Like you said, Rebecca, I understand and agree with the impulse behind giving people second chances. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think that one thing that people do not consider when they are thinking about expungement law is that when we lose access to public records, court records specifically in this case, we not only lose access to the individualized information about that one person, we lose our ability to aggregate information about larger processes. We
Mhm.
lose our ability, if, for example, if every case that gets thrown out is automatically expunged, we lose our ability to track whether prosecutors are being responsible when they file those charges in the first place, because now we can't see that the pattern that we would have been able to see if those cases hadn't been expunged. And so I think that there is a balance that needs to be struck. Possibly, courts could make it easier for us to get access to anonymized data, perhaps.
Mhm.
That would require them to be friendly to the press. And I don't know that that's particularly likely, but um, I think there's a real balance to be struck. And the other thing I wanted to say about expungement is that I think that court records in particular require journalists to be very thoughtful about the information that they are going to use, and that we can gain trust by doing that responsibly. So, for example, one time I was covering a case that involved a woman who was being stalked, and her personal information was not supposed to be included in the public records, but it was.
Mhm.
I would never publish that woman's name. And in fact, I called her lawyer and let her know that these records had not been properly redacted because I was concerned about a less scrupulous reporter finding that information. And as a result, first of all, I have a relationship for life with that lawyer who was incredibly grateful. And I also, I did the right thing and I used my power responsibly. And I think that that's something that journalists should be careful to do. So, for example, if we do have access to these court records, should we be using them to write stories about these piddling little charges against people who are vulnerable? Or should we be using them to challenge the power structures that allow prosecutors, allow the government to bring those charges against vulnerable people? And I think obviously the answer is the latter, but I think that in order to show our importance as journalists, we have to demonstrate our willingness to make those choices and to make them responsibly. So I think that's my speech on expungement.
I love that. Jeremy, I mean, that's a tough one to follow, but what do you have to add about expungement?
Doesn't come up very much in the environmental world, so I'm
Oh,
afraid
I
I'm
guess
gonna have
not.
to
Okay.
defer.
Well, and I think actually uh, to your point, Maddie, when you were talking about the woman who was stalked and her personal information being left out, to go back to that divorce proceedings bill that's wending its way through session right now. One of the most compelling stories was um, a woman whose personal information was let out because the record was not properly redacted. And so, my thought on that is that we don't automatically say, okay, well, nobody can have any of that ever because a court clerk made a mistake, and no, the system's not set up to hold that clerk accountable because it's just not. And it's I think sometimes hard to hear, you know, that's kind of the price you pay for openness and democracy and being able to look at the systems in a wider way. And so, like that idea of privacy in public records, sometimes it does feel icky. Like
Mm,
last year we had a bill which was defeated that would have clamped down autopsy records in Maryland. And that's like there is court precedent that specifically says everything about autopsy records should be available to the public. And I get that it feels kind of icky to be like, oh, let me read all the grisly details about X, Y, and Z. Um, but that, and so I'm interested to hear what you all think about that line between balancing privacy and openness in records. So I'm just curious, really.
No, I
Yeah.
think I think that's really difficult, and I agree with you, and as someone who has, gone like, I did a big story back in Pennsylvania based entirely on public divorce records,
Mhm,
for a man who went on to be convicted of murdering his new wife,
mhm,
and, like, yes, it feels gross to be digging through people's, information in that way. I think 2 things. I think number 1, unfortunately, that is the cost of being able to adjudicate your disputes in the public court system that is funded by taxpayers. That's the way it works. Um, and I think 2, I think that we can show through our stories why our access to these records is so important. So in that case in Pennsylvania, I was able to give insight into the very bizarre actions of this man that
mhm,
no one could understand because these records were public. And so while it did not, it didn't feel good for everyone involved, there was a clear public interest in being able to explain some of the background behind this high profile murder case.
mhm,
And so I think that we have to just show through our reporting why it's important for us to be able to access these. And I think that that includes being responsible. That means, maybe not reporting on the divorce records that, for example, if you get something that was improperly not redacted, being responsible and saying, I'm not going to put this stalking victim on blast. I am going to, exercise my journalistic responsibilities responsibly.
mhm,
Um, and I think that in doing that, we help build trust in our access to those records. But I agree with you. It's a very difficult area where people understandably have questions and concerns about our access. But I think we show how important our access is through our stories.
mhm.
Mhm.
Agreed. Anything to add, Jeremy?
Yeah, you're probably gonna face the autopsy records again and again. It obviously touches on a very powerful human uh, element there. And in my previous life, I've, covered a case of a young man who was, uh, drowned off of Ocean City. And
Right.
yeah, if you
Mhm.
remember that one.
Mhm,
Uh, and that was far from an easy case where, typically it's just a matter of course that the authorities release the names of victims of crime or of, any kind of uh, unusual circumstance. In this case, they didn't. And it was, from the outside, it was like, why is this case being treated differently? So it came out that, you know, back home where he was from, this was all well known. There were vigils at his school and social media. It wasn't a
mm,
problem finding the information. So it was like, well, why was this not shared with the public if the
mhm,
certain element of the public already seems to be well aware of this? And it wasn't merely just, well, we have to have the name so that we can, out this victim. It's a question of uh, being able to have within reason the same information that the investigators have so that we can make sure that they did what was supposed to be done here. And withholding this name, I think in this case, it wasn't because they had any connections to power or anything like that. I think they were, understandably in some ways, trying to navigate what the family wanted against the public's need to know. But it set, I think, a very troubling precedent in this case of
mhm,
uh, clouding the circumstances and making it difficult for the representatives of the public to do a proper look over the shoulder.
Mhm.
So I don't know. It's too bad to hear that folks are approaching this from a legislative standpoint, but I'm not surprised either.
No, and it happens every year. I mean, this is just something that it's part of the we monitor all the legislation in Maryland, Delaware, and the district, and it's Maryland certainly has this really well, there it's a spicier jurisdiction to begin with. There's going to be over probably
Hmm.
like 3,000 bills that the legislature will hear this session. So expungement and privacy, especially as it relates to like online privacy, that just is something in the zeitgeist right now. Um, in a space and time where none of us have a lot of privacy because we're so chronically online and everything's out there. So it's an interesting world. So as we wind up, I know you're not going to tell us your most exciting investigation that you're working on now. But where do you think challenges to investigative reporting lie? Is it as you look ahead, is it like time and capacity? Is it access to records? Is it disinterest on the public? Like how do you navigate that just as we kind of close out, and what do you hope comes next for your investigations?
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Okay. I think the biggest one is it's not like the Trump administration or Donald Trump like originated the idea, but you know, presidents stretch the truth, politicians lie sometimes. It's just that this administration has taken it to a level that we've never seen before.
Mhm,
And that's where I think public records have really the storytelling lately, the stronger storytelling has come from obtaining records that, you know, sometimes fly in the face of what the administration was saying.
mhm,
And that puts more of perhaps, the emphasis on the administration and other federal officials clamping down on public records, right? Because now it's not just a matter of, oh, the information might get out, but it also might contradict uh, the party line here. And so it's hard to think of a time in American history when public records have been so vital, than they are now.
mm,
I totally agree, and I think I would just, I think underline that by saying that, while it's not always to the same degree, I'm not gonna argue that both parties are doing this to the same extent, but politicians across the spectrum do these kinds of things. They do
mhm,
not want the press to be able to access records, to be able to talk to people that the people in power don't want us to talk to. In Maryland, which is a deep blue Democratic state, they are restricting press access to our ability to go around the security that we have always had as a result of our press badges that we get security background checks for. This is, it's everywhere. The government in general does not want us to be able to peek behind into the the back rooms of what they're doing, and it's everywhere, and it's a problem for every reporter, and it's a problem no matter what state you're in, no matter who you're covering, um, and it's just a problem that continues to get worse as journalism becomes weaker. And I don't mean the output of journalism, but I just mean there are literally fewer of us, and we don't necessarily have the institutional backing that we used to. And so, as that happens, people in power take notice of that and take advantage of it. And they know
mhm.
that we don't have the resources to fight back like we used to. And they try to take advantage of that. And I think it's very dangerous. It's something that the public needs to be constantly aware of and on the lookout for. And I think it's something that I don't see getting better in the near future unless there's a really concerted push for accountability and accessibility to records that belong to the public.
And I think that also comes back to something Jeremy said earlier, that you have to be intentional about the public has to be intentional about what they want, because it is journalism and investigations and getting that. People want the truth, they want accurate reporting, they want to know what's happening in their communities, And that doesn't happen just by magic. It happens, as you guys have shown, with just dogged step-by-step research, reporting, public records requests, and that all takes time and effort. It's not just a passion project. And I do see, as as more and more, as the world becomes more gig oriented or freelance oriented,
Mm.
you don't individuals don't have the capacity that a institutional newsroom has. And so we are looking at a seismic change. And I think at some point, members of the public have to rise up and say, this is important to us. Because where there are fewer reporters, there are higher incidences of corruption, of malfeasance, in a documented way. So I want to thank you both for coming to talk with me today and for the work that you're doing. It's not always easy or rainbows and kittens, but it's important and it's making change in the world. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for having us.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.